Bloomberg Audio Studios.
Podcasts, radio, news.
This is Bloomberg Businessweek. Insight from the reporters and editors who bring you America's most trusted business magazine, plus global business, finance, and tech news. The Bloomberg Businessweek podcast with Carol Messer and Tim Stenevec from Bloomberg Radio.
I do want to stick with Boeing because a lot happening with Boeing. Shares higher by about 2.3%. 6 months after a fuselage blowout threw Boeing into crisis, the full weight of the legal and financial fallout from the near catastrophic accident is bearing down on the company. The Justice Department plans to charge Boeing with criminal fraud after finding that the company violated a 2021 deferred prosecution agreement tied to previous fatal crashes. That's what Bloomberg News reported late Sunday. And then just hours later, Boeing announced a plan to buy back Spirit AeroSystems. Remember, this was a supplier that it spun off 2 decades ago. It's going to buy that for $4.7 billion. This a bid to improve manufacturing. We got with us George Ferguson, Bloomberg Intelligence Senior Aerospace, Defense, and Airlines Analyst. He joins us from Bloomberg Intelligence headquarters in New Jersey. George, I want to start with the U.S. Justice Department news that we got late yesterday. The plane maker is supposed to choose between pleading guilty or taking the risk of actually going to trial. This, according to people familiar with the matter cited in the Bloomberg News story yesterday. What are the implications for Boeing here?
Yeah, so I think if they decide they want to go to trial and fight this, I think the company does run the risk of being declared a felon. I guess I'm not a legal expert, so I understand companies can be convicted of felonies, I guess, and then that could make it difficult for them to get government contracts. And then you do run.
So that's what I wanted to talk about here. Because the government is a big customer of Boeing. And we talked a lot about this in the past with you. What's the complication here of the customer going after the company that they purchased from? And sort of I know you're not a lawyer or a legal expert here, but this gets really messy really quickly.
Yeah, and so I'll say again, I'm not a legal analyst, but from my financial industry analyst hat, having that on, I would say it gets even more complicated than you might expect because there are products they build for the U.S. government that I don't think anyone else could step into short term and supply. And I'll give you one, like the KC-46 tanker. They've had a lot of problems with it, a lot of cost overruns on it, but they supply that tanker to the U.S. military because the existing tanker fleet is 50 plus years old. And we need to rejuvenate that fleet. If the government decided they wouldn't buy any more from Boeing, Airbus could step in and provide a tanker, but it would take years and years. And then you run this, sort of second, sort of tier effect of, are you putting the company out of business? I mean, this is one of your most important defense contractors. So I think they reserve the right not to be able to give them any defense contracts, but I practically have a hard time seeing that happening.
And is that really the reason why the stock is up over 2% today? It's interesting, again, the contrast between the headline, which sounds very bad, and then you take a look at what the stock is actually doing. And this is a great day for the stock, and it hasn't had a lot of great days recently. And I mean, it just feels like at the end of the day, Boeing is an incumbent by a long shot here, a large margin.
It is, right? And look, it's not like there's no other defense contractors. There are, and there are other commercial aircraft manufacturers. But I would say the reason Boeing, I think shareholders are excited today is because it looks like some of the challenges to getting to a better place are starting to get fixed. And I would say, first of all, I don't think we've heard from Boeing on whether or not they're willing to accept this offer from DOJ. But generally, the offer that I saw, which included, someone that's going to come in and provide some more oversight, and included a fine, which I think brings the fine total to $500 million, and then would keep them out of a situation where they would have this felony against the company. That whole, again, not being a legal analyst, but that whole package appeared to be something that would be very manageable for Boeing to go ahead and accept. Now, I don't know all the interior details of that. So that doesn't look bad. It looks maybe better than we might have expected. And then at the same time, they announced that purchase of Spirit AeroSystems last night. It looks like Airbus would cart away the stuff that they need to make their airplanes and get paid some $500 million. We knew that was a loss-making business, but that clears up the major hurdle for Boeing to bring in Spirit, and bringing Spirit into the fold, I think, is the path to higher build rates and higher quality on the money-making 737. And Boeing really needs a really good second half to this year. They burned $4 billion of cash in the first quarter. They told us to expect similar numbers in the second quarter, and we've seen deliveries lower than they were in first quarter. So we could even see a worse cash burn in 2Q. They need to turn that around. We don't think they're going to get positive for the year, but they need to turn that around because they can't keep burning $4 billion a quarter and not run out of money sooner or later.
Hey, George.
It seems like they're starting to set things up.
George, with the Spirit deal, and especially that part going to Airbus, does that mean that Spirit will no longer have to sell, or Boeing will no longer sell to Airbus as a result of the way this transaction's working? Does Boeing not become a supplier for Airbus because Spirit was?
Exactly. This would peel away the Airbus pieces so that Boeing isn't responsible to deliver anything to Airbus so they can make aircraft.
Okay. So are there any other parts of Boeing's supply chain that you see moving forward that could get folded into Boeing?
Look, I think there's always a potential in it. So prior to the buy of Spirit, we saw Spirit buying in pieces of the supply chain. So obviously going forward, if you had these problems in the supply chain, and a lot of this is strategic buys where the supplier is breaking down financially, can't meet its commitments for quality or something, and they're going ahead and being absorbed into the company. So I think going forward, that means Boeing could do some smaller absorptions like that, purchases like that. I don't see any large size purchases by Boeing, anything this size, they'd have to pull in to fix supply chain.
And I want to talk a little bit about what this Spirit AeroSystem being bought by Boeing, what this means for the fundamentals of both companies, because we did get a headline from Moody's, for example, saying that ratings of Spirit AeroSystems on review for an upgrade. You take a look at the fact that this is all stock, and you have some people out on the street saying that this could help Boeing really hold off from a downgrade. And you think about the state of Boeing's financials right now, how important, George, just in about a minute, is that investment grade rating to Boeing?
Well, I think it's critical in case they have to get back into the bond markets and raise more money, and there's probably a decent probability that they might need to do that. And so I think Spirit not going to bring anything to the profit line for at least the first year or so. I mean, sort of 20. Well, this deal's not going to get consummated until 2025, so maybe they could bring a little bit, but not a big contribution to profit from Spirit. A little bit of contribution to revenue. I think the rating agency is still sort of looking through near-term challenges to better days.
Hey, George, we just have 10 seconds left, but what's one more thing that you're watching between now and the end of the year for Boeing's health?
Labor. Boeing's biggest labor union's coming to the table in September. They're getting a strike vote. Authorization is kind of near as I can read what that is in July. That's going to be a rough discussion.
Okay, we'll certainly have you back on before now and then to chat about that and everything at Boeing. That's George Ferguson from Bloomberg Intelligence. He's Senior Aerospace, Defense, and Airlines Analyst joining us from New Jersey.
You're listening to the Bloomberg Businessweek podcast. Catch us live weekday afternoons from 2 to 5 p.m. Eastern. Listen on Apple CarPlay and Android Auto with the Bloomberg Business app. Or watch us live on YouTube.
Well, as I mentioned, the Supreme Court case pretty much everyone has been waiting for. The court ruling that Donald Trump has some immunity from criminal charges for trying to reverse the 2020 election results, all but ensuring that a trial will not happen before the November election. The justices voted 6-3 along ideological lines, and this federal appeals court was too categorical in rejecting Trump's immunity arguments, the judges said, ruling for the first time that former presidents are shielded from prosecution for some official acts taken while in office. So let's get to the interview. We got with us Greg Stohr, Bloomberg News Supreme Court reporter. He joins us from our Washington, D.C. bureau. Greg, the court stopped short of tossing out the indictment like Trump wanted, but the former president said on Truth Social that it was a, quote, big win for our Constitution and democracy. How big of a win is this for the former president?
It is a huge win for him. First of all, from a political standpoint, he got the most important thing with regard to this upcoming election, which is there will almost certainly not be a trial before the election. That was something that Special Counsel Jack Smith was pushing for. He wasn't saying that explicitly, but he was pushing to have a quick trial. That's not going to happen. And then more broadly, the court, took a lot of things out of this indictment that said that, like his conversations with the acting attorney general, that can't be part of this indictment. And it raised questions about a lot of other things, including his conversations with Mike Pence, his public remarks on the ellipse right before the Capitol riot. The court raised questions about whether a prosecution could be based on those. So this indictment, even if it does go forward at some point to trial, may end up looking very, very different.
Well, let's talk also, too, about the fact that they did send this back to U.S. District Judge Tanya Chutkan, who is, of course, overseeing the case, basically giving it to her to decide what is off limits to the prosecution. What does that decision tree look like?
Yeah, so certain things are definitely off limits. As I mentioned, his communications with the Justice Department, the Supreme Court said that's an official act. You can't be prosecuted for that. The other areas that are in the indictment, Judge Chutkan's going to have to probably hold a hearing on each of those things. They may be separate hearings because the evidence about Donald Trump's conversations with state officials, for example, may be very different from the evidence about the tweets he put out or that speech he gave. And all those things need to be resolved before this case goes to trial. Probably what's going to happen is she'll make some rulings, and those rulings may go back up on appeal, all this before trial takes place.
Greg, what is the litmus test for official and unofficial conduct of a president?
Yeah, so the court, for the first time, provided some guidelines for what it thinks is the dividing line there. Now, keep in mind, up until today, there hasn't been such a thing as criminal immunity for presidents for official acts. But basically what it said was if the president is doing things that the Constitution explicitly says is exclusively the president's authority, that is totally off limits. And then for other things that we know the president does in the general course of doing the job, including things like speaking to members of Congress, speaking to the public, then what the court said was we need a really explicit a line from Congress, an explicit determination from Congress that we want the president covered under this provision. And then finally it said for things that are truly private, the president cannot or can be prosecuted for those. It sort of suggested the trappings of what went into the context of what went into a particular action may determine whether it was public or private.
And I want to talk about the fact that we are having this conversation in July. Of course, the term was extended slightly, and we had to wait until July 1st to actually get this decision. And the Supreme Court, it has faced some accusations of slow walking this matter, Greg.
Yeah, the court, if it had wanted to, could have resolved this much more quickly. Jack Smith, back in December of last year, asked the court to take the case up on an expedited basis. The court turned him down at that point, decided to take it up later on. There are certainly ways the court could have resolved this case so that there would be more of a question about whether a trial could actually happen this year. Instead, they scheduled arguments for the very last argument day of their term, and waited until the very last decision day of the term to resolve it. Now, there are a lot of really big constitutional questions in there. The majority justices undoubtedly felt like these are really, really important and we want to take our time. But the upshot of it is that it certainly has given Donald Trump a huge tactical victory.
Okay, so speaking of that victory, what happens if the former president is elected in November to this case?
Yeah, so the bottom line there will almost certainly be he can make this case go away. The exact mechanism may be a little bit complicated in terms of his instructions to the Justice Department, et cetera, and depends maybe on exactly where this case is in the pipeline. But he will be able to make it go away because he does have the authority as the head of the executive branch to tell the Justice Department what to do. Now, that may be, people are, I'm sure will say, that is a huge violation of the norms that have governed the Justice Department throughout our history. But as a practical matter, there's little question that Donald Trump will be able to do that.
Greg Stohr, certainly appreciate it. Bloomberg News Supreme Court reporter Greg Stohr joining us from our Washington, D.C. bureau. Continuing our coverage, we bring in Professor Carolyn Shapiro, founder and co-director of the Chicago-Kent College of Law's Institute on the Supreme Court of the United States. She joins us from Evanston, Illinois. Also with us here in our Bloomberg studio, David Westin, a lawyer and host of Bloomberg Wall Street Week at 6 p.m. Fridays on Bloomberg TV and radio. After law school, David clerked for J. Edward Lombard and the Second Circuit, and for Lewis F. Powell on the Supreme Court. Professor Shapiro, I do want to start with you, just broadly speaking, a question here about the power of the presidency. How does this Supreme Court decision today change the office of the presidency?
It changes the ability of the president to abuse the office in remarkable ways. Not only does the president have really remarkably broad immunity, although the contours are left very vague in this opinion. Remember that the president also has the pardon power. So a president could come into office, could decide to use his office to do things like assassinate his political rivals, order people in the government to do that, and promise them and then give them pardons for doing so. So I think it sets up the potential for a kind of dictatorship that we've never faced before. It's frankly quite terrifying.
And David, come on in here. I mean, when you think about this and the fact that, again, I keep coming back to the fact that we're talking about this in July. You think about the timeline here. And I mean, it just seems when you layer this on with the Supreme Court decisions that we got last week, and of course, with the debate, I mean, this just seems like the last week or so has really gone in Donald Trump's favor. And now there's this, which he is touting on social media as a big win.
Yeah, well, of course, I agree with Greg Stohr. The timing is everything here. And given the decision of the Supreme Court and how many things would have to be really decided by the district court, it's unlikely, I think, that they're actually going to get to a trial anytime before November. Having said that, let's go back a bit. This is a case of first impression. It's not as if the Supreme Court had decided a different way in the past. And so presidents all thought, oh, by the way, we have immunity or we don't have immunity, and that's why we're doing what we're doing. This is a different case. It's new. It was a split decision. It was not just down one way. It wasn't evenly split, but one side wanted absolute immunity across the board. The other side wanted no immunity at all. It was somewhere in between, and the court sent it back down to have some things reconciled. I'm not sure it leads to an automatic dictatorship or possibly a dictatorship, because I say I'm not sure presidents in the past have said, oh, by the way, I have total immunity so I can do everything I want, or on the other side said, I better not do that because I might get prosecuted for it. I'm not sure that's the way it's worked.
So, David, what would you say characterizes this decision in terms of the office of the president? How does it change the office of the presidency in your view?
Well, it certainly says if it's an unofficial act, all bets are off. We can prosecute you, whatever happens. It also says there are certain core values, powers of the president that are absolutely immune, without a doubt. And then there's a middle course, which, by the way, as we know, has been the case for some time. There are some areas where Congress and the president have jurisdiction to do things. In those areas, and this is where I think it is important, it did go Donald Trump's way. They didn't say it's a balancing between whether it interferes with what the president does and other values. It just said if it interferes with what the president wants to do, then he gets immunity. I do agree that really does put a thumb on the scale in favor of the president.
And Carolyn, let's talk about what is immediately next. Of course, this is being sent back to the U.S. District Judge basically to decide what is off limits, what is on limits, what basically counts as official and non-official. I mean, how straightforward is that process? How much time should that actually take?
I don't think we have any idea how much time it will take, and it's not going to be straightforward in large part because the majority gave very little guidance about how to reach those determinations. It does mean, though, that even though there will not be an actual trial before the election, that there may be an opportunity for Jack Smith to publicly lay out the allegations and evidence of the former president's acts in a way that is that would be similar to what might happen at a trial. And that's, I think, an important and although small silver lining to the Supreme Court sending it back to the district court.
Professor Shapiro, in the opinion, Chief Justice John Roberts wrote that, quote, "The president is not above the law." Does this ruling, though, effectively mean that the president is above the law?
It means the president is above the law often. And certainly any time the president is engaging in official acts, is probably above the law. The definition of the core functions that lead to absolute immunity is, again, it's not clear, but it actually is pretty broad. Includes things like the removal power of which is not explicit in the Constitution at all. The removal power of members of the executive branch, for example. They even mentioned the take care clause, which is ironic given that at the same time that they say the president's take care that the law be faithfully executed duties might be part of his core constitutional duties. They're giving him the authority and the ability to simply not follow the law. It's going to take a long time to really know, and at least one more round of appeals to really know how this is going to apply in this case. And I'll just add, I find this opinion shocking, and in many ways. And one thing that really astonishes me, frankly, is the court's inability to say, or unwillingness to say, that things that happened on January 6th itself were not official acts. The president made a speech to his followers. The then president made a speech to his followers on the ellipse. He sent out tweets encouraging people to come to Washington. In order to falsely and corruptly hold onto power. It's implausible to me that can be part of his official acts. And yet the court could not bring itself even to say that.
David, what were your thoughts around that? Because that was a question I didn't have a chance to ask Greg about, which is what happened on January 6th, or how the president acted on January 6th, was not in an official capacity. How did you read that in the opinion?
Whether rightly or wrongly, I think what the Supreme Court said was that's up to the district court to determine. What he said in the opinion, the Chief Justice, was, look, it's sometimes when the president speaks to the public, that is an official act. He's not saying every time it is, but sometimes it is. This may have been with that scope, and it's up to the district court to determine. So it's not as if they said it is official automatically what happened. He's exempt on January 6th. But they did leave open the possibility it might be determined to be that.
And Carolyn, I'm also...
compare that to what they said about his conversations with the Justice Department. What they say about his conversations with the Justice Department is that those conversations are in his core constitutional duties, and therefore he's absolutely immune. So they didn't send that back. It's true. They didn't say he's got immunity in particular for any particular act that happened on January 6th. But they couldn't bring themselves to say he doesn't.
Well, but I'm sorry, just to interrupt for a second, at least my understanding of it, you would understand it better than I do, Professor. Basically, they said, look, if Congress doesn't have the authority to limit or curtail the president's authority in some different direction, then you cannot prosecute him for it, almost by definition, because you're prosecuting him under a congressional statute. And it does seem plausible to me that Congress could not legislatively tell the president whether he can dismiss or not dismiss executive branch members, right?
Under current law, there are some executive branch members that he has the constitutional, that Congress can't say he can't dismiss. That's true. But the absolute immunity here goes beyond that. The absolute immunity here goes to conversations in furtherance, allegedly, but of this attempt to overthrow the election. And not only did the court say he has absolute immunity for those conversations, it said that his motives don't matter in determining when there's immunity, and that the government can't even rely on the acts for which he has immunity as evidence in support of the acts that they can charge him with. So the government can't tell the jury about what happened when he talked to the Justice Department as part of establishing the course of conduct that culminated in, and the motivations that culminated in, whatever it is that they are allowed to charge him with.
We only have about 30 seconds left, David, and I just want to end with you because you did spend time on the Supreme Court. when you clerked for Lewis F. Powell. We got 30
in ancient
seconds
days,
left.
we call
Well,
it.
but you have experience about how decisions like this are brought together and how they come together. Just 30 seconds on that.
Well, back in those days, I mean, people took it very seriously and went back and forth, and they debated and they discussed. I mean, I must say, I was there just a few years after the U.S. against Nixon, which was all the Republican-nominated justices did vote against Richard Nixon, which is a different, very different case. But it was different. I'm not sure that this Supreme Court is exactly like the one that I worked under, because there has been a lot more politics injected in it, and I think they've reached out for some cases. That's me editorializing. I think they've reached out for some controversial cases they didn't need to.
I think there would be a lot of people who might agree with that sentiment. A big thank you to Professor Carolyn Shapiro, founder and co-director of the Chicago-Kent College of Law's Institute on the Supreme Court of the United States, and also David Westin here at Bloomberg News. He's host of Bloomberg Wall Street Week at 6 p.m. Fridays on Bloomberg TV and radio, and yes, also a lawyer. This is Bloomberg Businessweek.
You're listening to the Bloomberg Businessweek podcast. Listen live each weekday starting at 2 p.m. Eastern on Apple CarPlay and Android Auto with the Bloomberg Business app. You can also listen live on Amazon Alexa from our flagship New York station. Just say, Alexa, play Bloomberg 1130.
Well, if you live in New Jersey and regularly commute into New York City, then I don't have to tell you that it's been brutal. Yeah, even more brutal than usual. The confluence of decades of underfunding, unusually hot weather, and aging infrastructure has led to a transit breakdown along the busiest rail corridor in the U.S. Experts warn that repeated delays and unreliable transit could cost the region's residents and businesses and threaten its economy. Michelle Kaske is a Bloomberg News reporter who has been covering transportation. She joins us here in the Bloomberg Interactive Brokers studio. So it's a pretty bad mix, Michelle, of warm weather, infrastructure that's old, some big investments that were not made over the last 20 or 30 years that could really alleviate some congestion when it comes to these rails. I'm talking about a specific tunnel. All this means that it could be bad economically for the city.
Definitely. I mean, this affects the city. It affects the region. We really need to get these millions of people a day through the area, going through New Jersey into Manhattan. And it's just, people are trying to get to work. They're trying to get to school. They're doing their shopping. They're going to medical appointments. There's the nightlife as well later on in the day. So there's a lot going on, and that's always been New Jersey's selling point of we're going to give you the best of both worlds. You can live here and live in these great neighborhoods and also have access to the New York City job market, all the fun stuff going on in New York City. And when it just becomes such a headache to get around and starts becoming very costly to get around, that's then becomes a harder sell.
Yeah, I mean...
You know something about this, Katie.
Yes, Katie does.
I'm from New Jersey. I drive out to New Jersey 3 times a week to go horseback riding. That's a different conversation. But every time I'm sitting in traffic in front of the George Washington Bridge, I curse the fact that Manhattan is an island. It's very difficult to get on and off. And, Tim mentioned how people have been mad with their commute for the delays. It's costly, and it got more costly today because fares on NJ Transit rose 15% today. That is the first hike in 9 years. Where is that money going towards? What was the justification for this hike?
Well, New Jersey Transit, they've had these big budget deficits, and so they needed to fill that hole. And they hadn't raised their fares in a few years, and they felt that it was time to turn to the riders and say, look, we need you guys to also help out with this budget shortfall.
It's interesting. We can't talk to you about this story without bringing in congestion pricing because it's actually mentioned in your story. Here's what Governor Murphy said. The service has been unacceptable. This is a unanimous opinion. I think that's fair.
That was actually Murphy who said that.
Yeah, Governor Murphy.
Governor Murphy. I'm sorry, I thought you said Hochul.
No, sorry, Governor Murphy is who I meant. The reason I bring him up is
Yes.
because he was very against congestion pricing.
He was.
And you also write that this got worse for the transit systems when congestion pricing was moved away or canceled indefinitely or postponed indefinitely. How do we thread that needle?
Yeah, they all rely on each other because some people are, they're getting off a New Jersey Transit and then they're getting on a New York City subway. And so people are using these different systems, and with the MTA, which runs the New York City subway system, what was going to happen was congestion pricing was going to start. That was going to bring in about $1 billion a year, and then the MTA was going to bond off of that to give them $15 billion over a series of years, and they could just do so much with investment in their infrastructure. They would update signals. Some of these subway signals are from the 1930s, so update those, and that'll help the subways run faster and to decrease delays. They were going to add more elevators into a lot of subway stations, and that really helps out people. And, we
also
all
people with
sometimes
kids
have
who are
to
pushing a stroller, or
Absolutely.
if you go grocery shopping. I mean, it's not
You've
just
got
people
a lot of
who use
stuff.
wheelchairs.
Maybe you have a sports injury.
Yeah.
So temporarily you can't do stairs for a while. So it's not just elevators aren't just for somebody who's above a certain age. It affects all of us at some point in our lives. So that was a very big issue. And and also this money would have gone towards extending the 2nd Avenue subway up into Harlem. So going from 96th Street to Harlem. So that was really going to add a subway system to an area that desperately needs it. And now the money's not coming in for now. Hochul calls it an indefinite pause. So we'll see what happens with that. But right now, that means less money going to the subways.
We only have about 30 to 45 seconds left with you, but going back to the New Jersey, New York commute,
Yes.
which I care very deeply about, I mean, what does the immediate future look like? Does this possibly get better this summer, or are we just going to have to deal with this?
Well, right now, what Amtrak and New Jersey Transit are doing is they're pledging that they're going to work together now.
Beautiful.
Yes, it's high time. Before they were really pointing fingers at each other, claiming that the other organization was at fault here, but apparently they're going to stop doing that, and they're going to investigate their infrastructure, really try to get to the root problem of how to solve it. Apparently there's these overhead wires that have been getting into trouble. They've been falling down.
Don't touch them.
Don't touch the overhead wires. Leave them alone. But that excessive heat is really putting a strain on the infrastructure. So we're hoping that those investigations help resolve this.
Michelle Kaske, she covers transportation for Bloomberg News here in our Bloomberg Interactive Broker studio. Her story among the most read on the terminal. Check it out at Bloomberg.com, and of course, always on the Bloomberg terminal.
You're listening to the Bloomberg Businessweek podcast. Catch us live weekday afternoons from 2 to 5 p.m. Eastern. Listen on Apple CarPlay and Android Auto with the Bloomberg Business app. Or watch us live on YouTube.
Workers fearing that their employers could use AI to replace them might be right. That's according to data in a Federal Reserve Bank of Richmond report. Are you worried about this? Are you worried about this?
If we go to 24/7 trading, we're going to need a lot more manpower. So, on the financial media side.
Yeah, AI power.
Yeah.
Well, okay, here's some details from that survey. We're Bloomberg. We like the numbers here. In a survey conducted earlier this month of firms that have used AI since early 2022 in the Richmond region, 45% said they were automating tasks to reduce staffing and labor costs.
I mean, it makes a lot of sense that businesses would be trying to do this. You think about all the fantastic applications of AI, that's a double-edged sword. Okay,
well, let's talk about some of those applications of AI with Julia White. She's Chief Marketing and Solutions Officer. She joins us from Seattle. Julia, good to see you. We heard a speech on Friday from Richmond Fed President Thomas Barkin. He said, quote, "We may well be seeing a move up in productivity, driven perhaps by automation or even AI." What are you doing at SAP right now in terms of making sure that your customers are more productive as a result of AI?
Yeah, certainly top of mind for us, and great to be back. Thanks for having me. As we think about how we infuse AI across all of the applications we provide enterprise customers, whether it's finance, procurement, HR, sales services, we are looking at ways we can use it to help people be more efficient, more productive in their work. We haven't seen a change in like the workforce around it, but certainly how they can be more productive and focus on the right things for sure.
And that's so interesting. I mean, it feels like at this point, a lot of the conversations about where AI can be useful, it seems like both, when it comes to the investment landscape, obviously when it comes to your business and when it comes to other industries, most of these conversations center around just increasing productivity. That seems to be where a lot of the conversations are centered.
Yeah, those are the early results that are probably easiest to see immediately, like, helping people with their HR process, creating goals, evaluating, having meaningful employee conversations as an example of productivity. But we're actually looking at more hard dollar savings too. For example, we've applied AI to warehousing and logistics use cases, and we're seeing people be able to decide which inventory goes where in which order. And so far, again, early, but still already seeing about $1 million savings per warehouse. And most of our customers have a dozen or more warehouses. So also looking for like efficiency and cost savings, not just productivity gains.
Where exactly are those savings coming from? That $1 million, where is it being saved?
Because we're getting the right inventory in the right place.
So it's all inventory management?
In that case, it is about distribution, but also getting trucks in and out faster. So just about efficiency of the fleet, and that gets into fuel costs, that gets into moving around and moving inventory to the different places that didn't need it originally.
So is it essentially just in time inventory, like on steroids?
Yeah, and helping it, yes, and being able to, right now, some of it's even still a manual process, right? So now we can make AI have a much more automated, so people aren't looking through physical bill of lading, but literally automating it and saying this over there, the rest of it to the next place.
And I guess sort of implied in Tim's question is, when you think about all the money being saved, how much of that money is coming from the fact that you have to pay less people? Because you take a look at that Richmond Fed survey that Tim cited, why businesses turn to AI, 45% said staffing costs, for example.
Well, and also staffing gaps too, of helping. We see a shortage in many places as well. So giving people the ability to do more with what they do have. I think both of those things are true.
Interesting. Okay. It's interesting. I look at SAP and it's having shares are up this year. It's having a really good year as opposed to some of the other software as a service companies. It's up more than 28%. So far this year, so outperforming the S&P 500 and NASDAQ 100. I'm talking about ADRs, I should note, of SAP. Why do you think, in your opinion, has SAP not suffered the same fate as some of the other software providers in a year where we're seeing IT decision makers move their budgets from software to hardware?
Yeah, well, I think we've seen people move budget to AI in a big way, where I think SAP is benefiting some of that. I think about the systems we build are pretty long-term, so we're a little bit less impacted by short-term kind of monetary change or changes around the economy. Because think about running your finances, running your HR, running your logistics and supply chain. Those need to continue and get more efficient. And I think we've shifted very quickly to put a lot of AI investment across that whole portfolio. And so unlocking new capabilities rather than people feeling like they have to go build AI separately or taking their AI budget and putting it elsewhere. So I think we brought that together and consolidated it around our solution areas.
Let's talk about some of your capabilities that you have over at SAP. You announced recently you're expanding integration of your own generative AI co-pilot, pronounced Joule. I hope I'm saying the name correctly. To me, it sounds like a woman. But
you can always ask the chatbot how to say the name.
Yeah, dear chatbot,
yeah.
What's your name? But give us an overview of Joule and how Joule is, different from other of the generative AI sort of co-pilots that are on the market right now.
Yeah, so Joule is the capability that's now built in across SAP solution. Again, whether it's finance, HR, procurement. And the great thing about Joule, because it is integrated across the whole portfolio of solutions, you can now engage and ask a question about, does my HR policy and my travel policy, how do those intersect? Or what about my procurement policies and my debt collection? How should I get more insight? So it's giving you that X-ray vision across those business processes, where today the systems are largely within their own silos. So the Joule capability gives you, kind of connects those dots across that whole set of data and ecosystem.
Does that end up? Well, go ahead.
And we also just announced too, we're going to be kind of industry first, integrating in a very seamless way our Joule Copilot and Microsoft 365 Copilot.
So how does that work? How do you integrate those
together? Yeah, so think about it's underlying integrating from the request and the prompt, and then the data handoff between the two. So I'm running a virtual team in Microsoft 365 Teams, and I need to bring in a new subject matter expert. I can flip over and ask Joule to find the right subject matter expert out of SAP SuccessFactors HR system, and then invite them to that team. So the handoff from a user perspective feels very seamless, but it's actually two different co-pilots working on their behalf.
And talk to us a little bit about some of the partners you have. Of course, you just mentioned one of them, but how do partnerships actually work in this ecosystem? What benefit do those bring necessarily?
We certainly partner with a wide range of large language model providers so that both our applications can always have the best based on what the use case is. But on top of that, kind of partnership with NVIDIA as example of creating really robust developer experiences. So if you're trying to develop extensions for SAP solutions, you're kind of super powered from that perspective. Or if I'm a consultant trying to deploy SAP solutions, the NVIDIA technology helping power that. As I already mentioned, the Microsoft 365 Copilot and Joule integration, or even with Google around rethinking and reinventing supply chain and bringing more AI to bear into the supply chain processes.
Let's say you're on with us 2 years from now, Julia. What's the conversation we're having?
I think we'll still be having the conversation around responsible and ethical AI. I think that's super important, and that will continue to be important in 2 years. But I think it's going to be more just assumed and understood in the way we work. I think about a few years ago when cloud was born and there was all this hand-wringing about IT losing jobs and what's going to happen. And I think in 2 years we'll work through there is going to be a lot of skill change. There's going to be a lot of what people functionally do, but there's going to still be lots of work to be done.
Julia White, Chief Marketing and Solutions Officer over at SAP, joining us from Seattle. Julia, good to have you back on with us. Do appreciate you taking the time.
I'm driving in my car. I turn on the radio.
How about you let me drive?
Oh, no.
Who's gonna drive you home?
Honey, please, I'll do the driving.
Drive on.
Excuse me, I want to drive.
You drive me crazy.
It's the question that drives us.
This is the Drive to the Close.
That funky music will drive us till the dawn.
On Bloomberg Radio.
Well, look at that. 18 minutes to go.
Wow, this is just flying by, Tim.
That's what happens when you join us on Bloomberg Businessweek, Katie Greifeld. And you're not napping in the afternoon like you usually do.
Yeah,
thanks for not napping, by the way.
I wouldn't miss it for the world. I got the call and I said yes.
Yeah, and tomorrow too, right?
Yes.
Okay.
And then that's it. Then I'm going on vacation.
Okay, that's
that was enough of that.
You got the call, you said yes to 2 days, and then you said no to the other 2 days. Hey, I'm really curious what Walter Todd is watching. He's president and chief investment officer over at Greenwood Capital Associates. They've got $1.6 billion in assets under management. Walter joins us from Greenwood, South Carolina. Walter, Katie called this a boring day.
Yeah.
You know what? If the S&P 500 so far this year is up almost 15%, you got to have some boring days in there. Walter, what are you watching?
Yeah, well, I feel like Phil Connors in Groundhog Day here. Tech outperforming, NVIDIA up, everything else underperforming. It's kind of been the story.
All right, Katie's never seen Groundhog Day, so.
But I was nodding along like I was there with you. So please continue.
You got to watch it, Katie. It's a classic.
It's a good one.
But nevertheless, I feel like I'm reliving the same day a little bit this year and really going back to 2023. So, yeah, we're obviously watching, the same thing over and over again, but looking forward to the payroll report on Friday, earnings in a couple of weeks. Of course, Powell speaks tomorrow, so that could be market moving. There's a couple of things on the radar there.
Which one's the potentially most impactful?
Yeah, I think payrolls are probably the biggest one because for us, we think that's really going to be the driver for the Fed potentially acting on cutting rates. I think everybody's focused on inflation, but I think the real driver for Powell will be if the labor market continues to kind of soften up, and we've seen some evidence of that with the disconnect between the payroll report and the household report really showing divergent signs in the labor market, one showing growth, one showing losses of jobs. So we'll be watching that carefully. And the Fed gets another 2 payroll reports beyond this one before the September meeting. So we think that's when they could potentially go if they decide to.
Walter, I have a stat for you. I've been thinking about it all day, that if you think about what we saw in June from the S&P 500, this comes courtesy of producer Dan Curtis, but the S&P 500 in June moved an average of 0.3% every day. That makes it the quietest month since the pandemic started. And I'm wondering, when you think about those really minuscule moves that we're seeing near all-time highs on the equity benchmarks, does that just speak to this being a summer lull, or do you see that basically as volatility coiling up here?
It could be a little of both, right? I mean, I always get nervous when you have these very quiet episodes, elongated episodes in the market. I think it takes me back to 2018 and that Volmageddon episode in February of 2018. So we've been 340 days, trading days without a 2% correction. That's the third longest streak since 2004. So you feel like we're kind of building up. You don't know what the catalyst will be in terms of what causes the volatility, but you feel like it's out there kind of waiting. So it does make me a little bit nervous heading into this payroll report on Friday.
And so what do you do with that sort of nervousness, that caution? I mean, do you try to just look through it, or do you maybe take a more defensive tilt in your portfolio as we head into what are normally these lower liquidity months?
Yeah, I mean, July is typically a good seasonal period for the stock market, but we've got some unique circumstances here with the election and the debate last week and everything that's going on with that. From our perspective, you try not to get too caught up in the day to day, but to the extent we have new money coming in, which we're fortunate to do with new accounts opening up, et cetera, we're really looking for opportunities, not necessarily fully investing those funds on day one. And looking for some volatility to hit, especially heading into earnings season, that will give us a chance to buy companies that we have a good fundamental long-term outlook for.
What do you like right now?
Yeah, so we're trying to look away from the shiny objects in the market right now. And look
so that
for
means look away
areas.
from NVIDIA?
Yeah, look away from the blinding sun of NVIDIA and look for opportunities, maybe other opportunities in technology and then beyond technology. Looking at healthcare, we think this is a very unloved sector given the flows of the ETFs out of that area and the relative performance to the market over the past 12 to 18 months has been pretty abysmal. So we think that's a good kind of contrarian candidate there. We think energy's very attractive on a valuation basis. NVIDIA's market weight's about twice the entire energy sector right now. I think they need energy to make chips, the last I checked. But so those are some of the areas that we like. But we do have some exposure to some of the bigger names in the market, just not NVIDIA at the moment.
Let's talk a little bit more about sort of those contrarian picks that you have, healthcare included. Healthcare and energy just feel like two sectors that make a lot of sense. People tell me about how they're bullish on those sectors and the logic really holds water. But then you take a look, like you said, at the relative performance, for example, the ETF flows, and just can't seem to get off the ground. So when you think about those unloved sectors that make sense as a contrarian play, what would be the catalyst here?
That's the golden question. I think you got to have patience, right? You got to have a little bit of longer term view with those, and it's hard to point to a specific catalyst other than the fact that when flows and sentiment move too far in one direction, whether that's positively into technology and semiconductors or whether it's negatively, out of healthcare, you tend to get to these inflection points that flip the other way. And so that's what we kind of anticipate from the energy perspective. There's a lot of potential catalysts out there, unfortunately, given the geopolitical environment that we're in, that could push oil higher and therefore, kind of catalyze those stocks.
And Walter, on July 1st, I mean, November feels a far way away, but we probably should talk about politics in some context here. It's interesting. I mean, you saw Morgan Stanley out with a note talking about what the Trump trade in bonds might look like. They think that adds into a yield curve steepener. But how are you thinking about politics as we head into November? Is this basically something that you try to ignore, or is this something that's actually worth positioning around?
Yeah, you try to, for us at least, we try not to make huge swings in the portfolio based on the outcome of elections. However, we have looked at, courtesy of our friends at Strategas, looked at the performance post the election in 2016 to kind of see how the market played there. And we really actually saw some evidence of that on Friday with regional banks specifically. So regional banks in the second half of 2016 were up 45% as a function of Trump being elected. And so we did see some upward move on Friday post that debate. So I think there's some things around the edges you could position for, but I think, again, given the uncertainty, and don't forget about Congress, we're talking about the president, that's the focus understandably, but we also have Congress up for grabs as well. And as long as we have a divided government, that's probably a good thing for markets if you look historically as well.
Hey, we only have 20 seconds left. Give us one place you don't want to be.
NVIDIA.
Really? Okay, 10 seconds. Why? Can't leave that.
It's the size of the UK stock market, the German stock market, the French stock market by itself. You're paying peak multiples for peak earnings, in our opinion. I know it's a very, very out of consensus call, but that's our view. There are other more attractive areas relative in the market.
I love it when people go against the grain. Thanks for joining us, and appreciate the calls. That's Walter Todd, President and Chief Investment Officer over at Greenwood Capital Associates, $1.6 billion in assets under management, joining us from Greenwood, South Carolina on this Monday afternoon.
This is the Bloomberg Businessweek podcast, available on Apple, Spotify, and anywhere else you get your podcasts. Listen live weekday afternoons from 2 to 5 p.m. Eastern on Bloomberg.com, the iHeartRadio app, TuneIn, and the Bloomberg Business app. You can also watch us live every weekday on YouTube and always on the Bloomberg Terminal.